Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. All right, everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a question that, well, has been around Mormonism for ages. Did Joseph Smith use existing publications to write the Book of Mormon?
Oh, for sure. A complex topic. Very complex. Definitely passionate arguments on both sides of this.
Yeah, exactly. So to all you listeners out there, faithful or maybe doubting Mormons, buckle up because we are turning this deep dive into, well, like a formal debate. I'm going to argue that Joseph Smith did, in fact, use these books.
Okay.
Our expert here will take the opposing side. We will present our cases, offer some counter-arguments, and then by the end, one of us will walk away victorious.
And listener, remember, the goal is not just to win. It's really to engage critically with these arguments and maybe even spark some of your own exploration of this really fascinating historical puzzle, right?
Right. Okay, so let's set the stage. Early 1800s. The theory that Native Americans, they descended from these lost tribes of Israel, it was incredibly popular.
Yeah.
I mean, think of it like the ancient aliens theory of today, right?
Yeah. It wasn't just a fringe idea either. Books like View of the Hebrews, Star in the West, or The History of the American Indians, these were widely read, discussed. It was a mainstream theory.
Which makes it super likely that Joseph Smith, being a young man immersed in this environment, he would have been familiar with these ideas.
Plausible, yeah. That's certainly plausible, but familiarity doesn't automatically equal influence.
Right.
Just because he knew about a theory doesn't mean he used it to write the Book of Mormon.
Okay,
Yeah.
true. But here's where things get interesting. When you compare View of the Hebrews, right, to the Book of Mormon, you see these striking parallels in the narrative structure. Like both tell the story of a group of Israelites. They go to this new land, divide into these civilized and savage factions. Ultimately, the civilized group is destroyed by the savages.
Yeah, these broad similarities, undeniable. To build a solid case, though, we need to move beyond just this general framework. We need to examine the specifics, right?
All right, yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty. View of the Hebrews, published in 1823, focuses on the lost 10 tribes of Israel. But the Book of Mormon, translated starting in 1827, centers on this family from the southern kingdom of Judah.
Okay.
Different tribes, different timelines.
That's a crucial difference.
Right.
Ethan Smith, he was the author of View of the Hebrews. He believed those tribes migrated across the Bering Strait centuries ago. The Book of Mormon talks about a transoceanic voyage, much more dramatic, some might argue, improbable journey.
Okay, so different routes, different timelines. But both stories, they feature a buried book, don't they?
Yeah.
Ethan Smith mentions this old Indian who tells a reverend about his ancestors. They had this book, but they buried it. They couldn't read it anymore. Sound familiar?
It is intriguing, this buried book motif. However, in View of the Hebrews, this book is lost, the contents unknown. In the Book of Mormon, golden plates, they hold this divine record,
Right.
a testament of Christ, meant to be revealed to the world.
Okay, different purposes then for these buried books. But both stories, they use this phrase, Great Spirit, to describe the deity worshipped by Native Americans. That's pretty specific, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, the use of Great Spirit does reflect, I guess, a specific understanding of Native American spirituality. But it was a concept already circulating in broader discussions about, indigenous religions, attributing it only to the View of the Hebrews, a bit of a stretch, don't you think?
Okay, fair point. But Ethan Smith also describes how this more civilized Israelite group is wiped out by this savage faction. And that mirrors the Nephites and Lamanites in the Book of Mormon. Pretty specific parallel, isn't it?
I mean, they both narratives draw on that common trope,
Right.
civilized versus savage. But you got to remember, the Book of Mormon places this conflict within this larger theological framework, right? Like this whole grand narrative of righteousness, apostasy, and then redemption.
Right, so theological frameworks are different. But what about the shared use of biblical themes and prophecies, especially Isaiah?
I mean, the Bible was the central text for early Americans. It's natural that these biblical themes would appear in their writings, but the way Isaiah's prophecies, they're woven into the Book of Mormon's narrative, the specific passages quoted and reinterpreted, suggest maybe something more than just familiarity.
Right, it's almost as if Joseph Smith, He took those prophecies and applied them to the experiences of the Nephites and Lamanites, and that gives them this new layer of meaning.
And let's not forget that the Book of Mormon actually has entire chapters from Isaiah verbatim, which View of the Hebrews does not. And that level of direct biblical, incorporation is significant.
All right. So we've got similar narrative structures, shared interest in Isaiah's prophecies, and even this buried book motif. But what about Joseph Smith's access to these books? Did he even have a chance to read them?
That's a critical question. Let's look at the timeline. View of the Hebrews was published in 1823. Now, there's no definitive proof that Joseph Smith actually had a copy, but it was a popular book in his region, so access is likely.
And remember, there are accounts of Joseph Smith discussing View of the Hebrews with other people, suggesting, a level of familiarity that's more than just hearsay.
Interesting accounts, but they're often secondhand or even third-hand. It's hard to verify their accuracy.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So circumstantial evidence, but no smoking gun. What about the other books?
Well, The Late War, it was published in 1816. It was a popular account of the War of 1812, widely available.
And it's written in this distinct style that it mimics the King James Bible, which is also, the language of the Book of Mormon. Coincidence?
Yeah, that shared linguistic style, it's noteworthy. However, that Jacobean English used in the late war, it was pretty popular in a religious writing at the time, so it could simply reflect like a broader literary trend, not direct influence.
Okay, Jacobean English, a red herring maybe. What about First Book of Napoleon, published 1809? Tells the story of Napoleon's rise to power. And there are some parallels with the Book of Mormon in its descriptions of warfare and political intrigue.
Yeah. First Book of Napoleon, it was less popular than the other two, but it's still conceivable that Joseph Smith could have come across it. However, the thematic connections are much, much more tenuous.
Perhaps. But all three of these books, they were circulating in Joseph Smith's world during those really formative years, right? So it's hard to imagine that a young man with like a curious mind, a penchant for stories, wouldn't have been exposed to or even, I don't know, influenced by these narratives.
I mean, that's plausible, but exposure doesn't automatically equal borrowing or, plagiarism. We got to examine the evidence very carefully, weigh the arguments, avoid jumping to conclusions.
Well said. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We're digging deep, considering different perspectives, and hopefully helping our listeners, sharpen those critical thinking skills.
Oh, yeah. We've explored some interesting parallels, for sure. But listener, remember, proving influence, it needs more than just similarities. We have to go deeper, analyze the nuances, consider that broader historical and literary context.
Right, exactly. So let's revisit View of the Hebrews. One thing that I thought was interesting was how passionately Ethan Smith argues for missionary work among the Native Americans. Like he really believes it's the duty of white Christians to share the gospel with their indigenous brethren. That echoes the Book of Mormon's emphasis on missionary work too, right?
Well, both texts, they definitely reflect this missionary impulse, right? Which was, a huge part of that early 19th century religious landscape, like converting Native Americans to Christianity. That was a major thing for many denominations.
And remember, right after the Book of Mormon was published, the church was organized, and Joseph Smith sent missionaries to Native American populations out on the western frontier.
That's right, yeah. And that missionary effort, it continued, like for decades, right?
Yeah.
Driven by the belief that that Native Americans, they were descendants of those lost tribes of Israel, and therefore potential heirs to the Abrahamic covenant. This was, a very common theological idea at the time.
But here's a big difference that we haven't really talked about yet. View of the Hebrews says explicitly that Native Americans, they had no writing system. But the Book of Mormon, it talks about, this sophisticated civilization with a written language on metal plates. That's a pretty big contradiction, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it definitely presents a challenge for those arguing that View of the Hebrews directly influenced the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith was just copying from Ethan Smith. Why wouldn't he include that detail about the lack of writing? It would have made his narrative, I guess, more consistent with the theories about Native Americans that were, already out there.
Maybe he felt that a written language, it was like essential to the story, like a way to make the idea of an ancient record believable.
Yeah, possible. A written language, that changes the Book of Mormon's narrative from, just a bunch of oral traditions into like a tangible historical document.
Okay, so the written language might be a point where they diverge. But what about that motif we talked about, the buried book? Ethan Smith tells a story about a reverend, right? He learns from an old Indian that his ancestors, they had this book, but they buried it because they couldn't read it anymore. And the Book of Mormon, well, it has its own buried book, the Golden
Yeah,
Plates.
fascinating parallel. It shows how certain themes and motifs, they were, in the culture already. They were shaping how people saw Native American history and spirituality.
Exactly, exactly. And it's not just the buried book itself. It's the idea that these books hold like lost knowledge, hidden truths, waiting to be rediscovered.
Yeah, yeah. That was powerful, that theme, rediscovering lost knowledge. Powerful in the 19th century, all this, intellectual and religious change happening. People were searching for answers. They looked to the past for guidance and inspiration.
And both View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon, they tap into that longing for ancient wisdom.
They do, but the nature of that wisdom, the reason for those buried books, they're different. In View of the Hebrews, the book shows like a lost connection to the past, forgotten heritage. But in the Book of Mormon, the Golden Plates, they hold a divine message, a testament of Christ to guide humanity back to God.
Okay, different purposes. But what about Isaiah's prophecies? The emphasis on them. Ethan Smith, he spends a whole chapter analyzing Isaiah's predictions,
Yeah.
about scattering and gathering Israel. He applies them to his theory about Native Americans.
Yeah, and the Book of Mormon, it also quotes Isaiah a lot, extensively, even includes some chapters word for word. Both of these texts, they use Isaiah to back up their claims about Israel's destiny and their connection to the New World.
It's almost like Joseph Smith. He took Ethan Smith's interpretation of Isaiah and made it bigger, woven it into this whole big narrative about prophecy, fulfillment, and redemption.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. It could mean that Joseph Smith, he knew about some interpretations of Isaiah that were around at the time. But remember, Isaiah was, he was a popular topic for preachers, theologians in the early 19th century. So using those prophecies doesn't automatically mean direct borrowing from View of the Hebrews.
Okay, okay. So we have shared themes, biblical references, this buried book idea. But what about the things that View of the Hebrews mentions that are not in the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, yeah, those are important to think about. Ethan Smith, he uses all kinds of evidence to back up his theory, like connections between Hebrew and Native American languages, cultural practices that supposedly, mirror ancient Israelite traditions, even like physical artifacts. The Book of Mormon, none of that.
So you're saying that the Book of Mormon doesn't mention those specific things. That actually makes the argument for its originality stronger.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. If Joseph Smith was, just copying Ethan Smith, why not include that easy evidence? It would have made his claims, stronger, made the Book of Mormon more believable to the people back then.
That's a good point. It suggests that Joseph Smith, he wasn't just repeating existing theories. He was making a narrative with its own logic, its own set of priorities.
Exactly. And this brings us to another interesting part of all this. The connection between Ethan Smith and Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith's scribe, during the translation.
Ah, yeah, the Oliver Cowdery connection. Some people think that Oliver, he knew about View of the Hebrews through his family's church, and maybe he shared those ideas with Joseph Smith. And that sparked the whole creation of the Book of Mormon. It's pretty interesting, isn't it?
It is. It is. And for a long time, people believed that Oliver Cowdery's family went to Ethan Smith's church in Pulteney, Vermont. But more recent scholarship, well, it's challenged that.
So no hard proof that Oliver ever even read View of the Hebrews or even knew about it.
Right, that's correct. We know Oliver grew up in a community where, those ideas about Native Americans, lost tribes of Israel, they were everywhere. So the cultural context, that's relevant for sure, even if we don't have this direct link between Oliver and View of the Hebrews.
And even if Oliver had read the book, he didn't meet Joseph Smith until 1829. Right, after the translation had already started.
The timeline, yeah, that is a challenge. For those who believe that Oliver introduced Joseph to View of the Hebrews, it seems more likely that both Joseph and Oliver, they were drawing from like this shared well of ideas that were already circulating.
So the Oliver Cowdery connection, while it's interesting, it's probably more of a historical curiosity than like a smoking gun.
I think that's fair. Yeah, we can't say for sure that Oliver didn't have any influence, but we just don't have the evidence to make any firm conclusions.
All right, so we've looked at View of the Hebrews. We talked about the Oliver Cowdery connection, and we found some interesting similarities and some big differences too. So where do we go from here?
Well, we still have two more books to talk about, right? The Late War and First Book of Napoleon. Let's see what they might tell us.
All right, we've been going back and forth about whether Joseph Smith might have gotten inspiration from existing books. Now
Yeah.
it's time to tackle that last piece.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating piece. This CES letter, it's caused a lot of discussion lately. It brings up these really interesting questions about possible biblical influences on the Book of Mormon.
So for those who haven't heard of it, the CES letter, it basically argues that the Book of Mormon, it's got passages that are super similar to verses from the King James Bible, and not just in general themes or ideas, but sometimes word for word.
Right. Yeah, a big claim. Challenges how people traditionally see the Book of Mormon, as this direct translation of these ancient records. And it raises this possibility that Joseph Smith was, maybe influenced by the biblical language that he knew.
The CES letter gives a bunch of examples of these parallels, and some of them are, well, they're pretty striking. Like it compares Isaiah 9.1 from the KJV with 2 Nephi 19.1. The words are, I mean, they're almost identical, just a few, small changes.
Yeah, they are remarkably similar, but gotta remember both of these are prophetic. So maybe they're drawing on, a shared tradition or source material. It's possible the similarities are just from a common source, not direct copying.
Okay, but what about 3 Nephi 13.2527 and then Matthew 6.2527? Those passages, they both talk about worrying about material things, and they're, I mean, practically identical word for word.
Yeah, that's more convincing. The words and the topic are so close. It does make you wonder about possible influence. Hard to say it's just, coincidence.
And here's where things get even more interesting. The CES letter says that Joseph Smith's own translation of Matthew 6.25, you find it in the Joseph Smith translation, or JST. It's totally different from the King James Version.
Hmm. That is fascinating. If Joseph Smith thought the KJV was accurate and, inspired by God, why would he change it?
It suggests maybe he wasn't totally tied to that biblical text. Maybe he saw translation as more dynamic, where you could interpret, adapt.
That's possible. It challenges this idea of translation as just, mechanical, and it opens up this idea of creative inspiration, even influence from, existing biblical sources.
Right. So we're not saying Joseph Smith just copy and paste it,
Yeah.
but we are saying that biblical language and themes, they could have shaped his thinking and writing.
Exactly, yeah. The Bible was, super important to Joseph Smith, source of, religious and spiritual inspiration, so it's natural for its language, its stories, its imagery to be in his work.
Okay. So how do we put those biblical parallels together with with the Book of Mormon saying it's authentic from God?
Yeah.
That's something a lot of faithful Mormons think about.
It requires, I think, a nuanced view of revelation
Hmm.
and inspiration, recognizing that God can work through people, even if those people are influenced by their own culture, their intellectual background.
So we're not saying there's no divine inspiration, but we're also seeing the human side, how Joseph Smith's experiences and knowledge could have shaped the text.
Exactly. It's complex, divine and human together. I don't think we can totally, separate those things. It's a mystery that people have to wrestle with in their own faith.
Well said. Now, let's switch gears a little. Let's go back to the late war
Huh.
and First Book of Napoleon. We touched on these earlier, but there's a few more details we can look at.
Sure, sure. The late war, with all its descriptions of battles, military stuff, it does have some interesting things in common with the Book of Mormon's war stories.
Yeah, like both of them use this phrase, "it came to pass," a lot. It's a really distinctive way of writing,
Yeah.
like the King James Bible.
Yeah, that it came to pass. That is noteworthy. But it was a common biblical idiom. They used it to start a new event or scene.
True. But the sheer number of times they use it in both
Yeah.
texts and then other similar writing styles, it makes you wonder if there's a connection.
Yeah, the writing styles are interesting, but we got to be careful about making conclusions based just on words that look similar. Remember,
Right.
both authors were writing when biblical language was everywhere.
Okay, fair enough. But what about specific parts of the story that seem to uh, mirror each other. Like both the late war and the Book of Mormon, they talk about these bands of robbers who, attack the good guys.
Hmm. That is interesting. Those bands of robbers, maybe they show this shared worry about lawlessness and social problems. It was something that, that people in the early 19th century were thinking about.
And both texts talk about engraving records.
Yeah.
They both thought it was important to preserve history and pass down knowledge.
Another thought-provoking parallel, this idea of keeping knowledge safe in writing, that was a big deal, especially when being able to read was getting more important.
Okay, so we got similar writing styles, similar things happening in the story, and they both think ancient records are cool. What about First Book of Napoleon? Does it tell us anything about where the Book of Mormon came from?
First Book of Napoleon, I mean, it's less connected to the Book of Mormon than the other two, but it still has some interesting things in common. Like both texts talk about battles at forts, where the good guys are fighting off attacks.
And both mention building ships, which ties into to the Book of Mormon's story about the Jaredites crossing the ocean.
Yeah, the ship thing is that's interesting. It shows that they both knew about voyages across the ocean and the challenges of exploring by sea. A big theme back then.
All right, so we've looked at these possible influences, view of the Hebrews, the late war, and First Book of Napoleon. We've found some pretty convincing similarities, but we've also said that it's tricky to prove direct influence.
Yeah, exactly. Saying that the Book of Mormon came just from these books, that'd be way too simple. It's more likely that Joseph Smith, like any writer, he was influenced by a lot of things. Some he knew about, some he didn't.
So to wrap up this debate, let's sum up our main points. I've said that the things the Book of Mormon and these other books have in common, they're too many and too specific to just be coincidence.
And I've said that while those similarities are interesting, they don't prove that he copied directly or plagiarized. Joseph Smith was, I mean, he was a man of his time, and his work it shows the culture and ideas of the early 19th century.
It's been a pretty interesting back and forth, I'd say.
Oh, for sure. And I think our listeners got to hear a really thoughtful discussion.
So who wins the debate? Well, I gotta give it to our expert. Their arguments have been, I mean, insightful, well thought out, and they really show a deep understanding of history.
Oh, thanks. But I think the real winner is the fact that we're even asking these questions. We looked at this complex topic with open minds. We were willing to, question things, and we stayed respectful.
Well said. And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring. Don't just take our word for it. Read the sources, do your own research, and come to your own conclusions.
Yeah, the journey of discovery is it's often better than just getting a final answer.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Book of Mormon's origins. We hope it sparked some curiosity and made you want to keep searching, keep questioning, keep exploring.
And until next time, keep thinking.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.